The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, but Astrid Ironborn knew this would be no peaceful day. From her position atop the wooden watchtower, she could see the black sails on the horizon, dozens of them cutting through the grey waters with predatory intent. The rival clan of Bloodaxe had finally come to settle old scores. "Sound the horn!" she shouted down to the village below, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned her place through countless battles rather than birthright. The deep, resonant call of the war horn echoed across Ravenholm, rousing warriors from their morning meals and sending children scurrying toward the great hall. Astrid descended the ladder with practiced ease, her weathered leather boots finding purchase on each rung despite her haste. At 28 winters, she had served as shieldmaiden to Jarl Eriksson for over a decade, earning respect through her tactical mind and unwavering courage. Her auburn hair, braided with iron rings and feathers from her first kill, caught the pale sunlight as she strode through the village centre. "How many ships?" asked Bjorn the Stout, the Jarl's second-in-command, as he emerged from the smithy still clutching a half-forged blade. 15 longships, maybe more," Astrid replied, checking the leather straps of her shield and the weight of her seax at her hip. "They'll beach within the hour." The village erupted into controlled chaos. Warriors donned mail shirts and hefted axes, while the elderly and infirm helped guide children toward the stone-built Great Hall that would serve as their last refuge if the battle went poorly. Astrid had seen this dance of preparation many times before, but something felt different today, heavier, as if the very air held the weight of destiny. Jarl Eriksson emerged from his longhouse, his grey beard braided with silver rings that marked his victories in distant lands. Despite his 60 winters, he moved with the controlled power of a veteran warrior. His pale blue eyes found Astrid immediately. "They come in greater numbers than expected," he said, his voice carrying the gravitas of a leader who had guided his people through countless trials. "But we have advantages they do not. This is our land, our home. Every stone and tree knows our footsteps." Astrid nodded, but privately she calculated their odds. Ravenholm could muster perhaps 40 fighting men and women, while the approaching fleet could carry 3 times that number. The defensive position would help, but against such overwhelming odds. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice so only the Jarl could hear. "I saw their banner. It's not just Bloodaxe clan. They've allied with the Iron Wolves and the Ravagers. This isn't a raid for cattle and silver. They mean to destroy us completely." Eriksson's weathered face grew grim. The 3 clans had been enemies of Ravenholm for generations, but never before had they unified their hatred. Someone had convinced them that together they could eliminate their common rival once and for all. "Then we fight as our ancestors did," he declared, raising his voice so all could hear. "With courage in our hearts and steel in our hands. Better to die with honor than live as thralls." The warriors responded with fierce battle cries, beating shields with weapon hilts in the ancient rhythm that had carried their people through countless conflicts. But Astrid noticed the tightness around some eyes, the way mothers held their children just a moment longer before sending them to safety. Everyone understood the stakes. As the longships drew closer, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the morning waves, Astrid positioned the defenders according to the plan she and Eriksson had developed over years of preparation for just such an attack. Archers took positions behind the wooden palisade, while the strongest warriors formed a shield wall at the main gate. Others concealed themselves among the buildings, ready to strike at the flanks when the battle was joined. The first wave of attackers reached the shore, just as the sun climbed high enough to burn away the morning mist. Astrid watched from her position near the great hall as warriors poured from the beached longships like angry wasps from a disturbed nest. Their war cries echoed off the surrounding cliffs, mixing with the crash of waves and the screech of circling ravens drawn by the promise of carrion. "Hold steady!" Eriksson commanded as the enemy force organized itself on the beach. "Let them come to us!" But the attackers were not hasty young raiders seeking easy glory. These were seasoned warriors led by experienced jarls who understood the cost of storming a defended position. They formed their own shield walls, overlapping their round shields painted with the symbols of their clans: the blood-red axe, the snarling wolf's head, and the black raven with outstretched wings. The battle began with a deadly rain of arrows from both sides. Astrid crouched behind her shield as shafts whistled overhead, some finding gaps in the palisade to claim their first victims of the day. She heard the wet thunk of iron points biting deep into wood and flesh, followed by screams of pain and rage. Then came the charge. The three-clan alliance surged forward like a tide of iron and fury, their war cries drowning out even the sound of their own thundering footsteps. Astrid felt the familiar cold calm that always descended upon her in battle, her mind becoming crystal clear as time seemed to slow. She had survived so many fights by trusting in this state, letting instinct and training guide her actions while conscious thought focused on the larger tactical picture. The shield walls met with a crash that shook the very ground. Astrid found herself face to face with a massive warrior whose beard was stained red with berry juice to match his clan's colors. His axe swept toward her head in a killing arc, but she deflected it with her shield while her sayax found the gap beneath his arm. Hot blood sprayed across her face as he fell, but there was no time to savor the victory. Another enemy was already pressing forward to take his place. The battle raged through the morning and into the afternoon. Bodies piled high before the gates of Ravenholm as wave after wave of attackers threw themselves against the defenders. Astrid lost track of her individual fights, existing in a red haze of thrust and parry, advance and retreat. Her shield arm grew numb from deflecting countless blows, while her sword arm ached from the constant work of dealing death. But gradually, inevitably, the tide began to turn against the defenders. For every enemy warrior that fell, it seemed two more stepped forward to take his place. Gaps appeared in Ravenholm's shield wall as exhaustion and wounds took their toll. Astrid saw old Gunnar collapse with 3 spear points in his chest, his position immediately swarmed by howling raiders. Young Olaf, barely old enough to grow his first beard, fell with his skull split by a bearded axe. "Fall back to the second line," Eriksson commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of battle. Blood streamed from a gash above his left eye, but his sword arm remained strong as he cut down another attacker. The defenders retreated in good order, giving ground slowly while making the enemy pay dearly for every step. But Astrid could see the inevitable end approaching. They had fought magnificently, beyond what anyone could reasonably ask of mortal warriors, but flesh and blood could not stand forever against such overwhelming numbers. It was then that she noticed the smoke beginning to rise from the eastern quarter of the village. Some of the attackers had flanked around the main battle to fire the buildings. Orange flames licked at thatched roofs, spreading with terrifying speed in the dry autumn air. Soon, half the village was ablaze, filling the air with choking smoke and the desperate screams of trapped animals. "The Great Hall!" someone shouted. "They're trying to burn out the children!" Astrid's blood turned to ice. The stone walls of the Great Hall could withstand fire, but the wooden roof could not. If the attackers succeeded in setting it ablaze, everyone sheltering inside would face a horrible choice between burning alive and fleeing into the arms of waiting enemies. Without thinking, she broke from the shield wall and sprinted toward the threatened building. Behind her, she heard Eriksson's voice raised in desperate command as he tried to rally his remaining warriors for one final stand. But Astrid's attention was focused solely on the Great Hall and the precious lives it contained. She rounded the corner of a burning storehouse to find 3 enemy warriors already at work, piling kindling against the hall's wooden door, while a 4th prepared to light it with a burning brand. These were not front-line fighters but older men assigned to support duties, and they turned in surprise as Astrid's war cry split the smoky air. Her sayax took the first man in the throat before he could raise his weapon. The second managed to get his shield up in time to block her follow-up strike, but Astrid spun and brought her sword around in a devastating arc that opened him from hip to shoulder. The third warrior, seeing his companions fall so quickly, threw down his weapons and fled into the smoke. But the fourth man, the one with the burning brand, was not so easily discouraged. He was younger than the others, with the lean build and quick movements of an experienced scout. As Astrid turned toward him, he thrust the flaming wood not at her, but at the carefully piled kindling. "Too late, shieldmaiden," he snarled. "Your precious little ones will roast like spring lambs." The kindling caught with a hungry roar, flames immediately beginning to spread up the wooden door. But as Astrid prepared to cut down this final enemy, her eyes caught something that made her freeze in amazement. There, half hidden beneath a pile of the man's discarded supplies, was something that should not exist, something that legends claimed had vanished from the world centuries ago. A dragon egg. It was perhaps the length of her forearm, its surface covered in scales that shifted between deep emerald and midnight black, depending on how the light struck them. Even in the chaos of battle and fire, she could feel the warmth radiating from its surface, as if something alive stirred within. This was no ordinary stone or carved ornament. This was the genuine article, one of the great treasures that had once been fought over by kings and heroes. The scout noticed her stare and followed her gaze to the egg. His expression shifted from triumph to desperate greed. "Aye, that's mine now," he growled. "Found it in the ruins of an old watchtower, I did. Worth more than this entire miserable village." But as he reached for the egg, the flames from the burning door suddenly flared higher, driven by a gust of wind that sent sparks swirling through the air. One landed on the scout's woolen cloak, and within seconds he was ablaze, screaming as he rolled in the dirt trying to extinguish the flames. Astrid didn't hesitate. She snatched up the dragon egg, surprised by how warm it felt even through her leather gloves, and turned her attention to the burning door. The flames were spreading quickly, and she could hear frightened voices from within the hall. There was no time for careful planning. She would have to act on instinct and hope the gods favored the bold. Using her shield to protect herself from the worst of the heat, she kicked at the burning timbers, trying to scatter them before they could spread the fire to the stone walls. But the flames were too well established, fed by the dry wood and fanned by the wind. As she worked, she became aware of a strange sensation. The dragon egg in her free hand was growing warmer, almost hot enough to burn through her gloves. Then something extraordinary happened. The egg began to glow with an inner light, soft at first, but quickly growing brighter. The light seemed to have a calming effect on the flames, causing them to flicker and dance, but not spread. It was as if the fire itself was responding to the presence of the ancient relic. Astrid stared in wonder, but the sound of splintering wood brought her back to the immediate crisis. The door was weakening under the assault of flame and heat. Soon it would collapse, letting the fire into the hall itself. She had to find another way. Racing around the building, she found a small window high up on the western wall, too small for a warrior to climb through, but large enough for her purpose. She called up to the people inside, her voice cutting through their frightened murmurs. "This is Astrid. Stay calm and listen carefully. The main door is blocked by fire, but I have another way. Ericsson's daughter, Ragnhild. Are you there?" A young voice answered from within. "I'm here, Astrid." "Good. You're the smallest. I need you to climb up to the window and catch something I'm going to throw to you. It's very important, more important than gold or silver. Can you do that?" "Yes, I'm ready." Astrid looked down at the dragon egg in her hands. It was still glowing with that strange inner light, warm enough that she could feel it through her gloves. Every instinct told her this was no ordinary treasure. This was something connected to the old stories, the legends of the time when dragons soared through northern skies and heroes could speak with the spirits of fire and storm. But there was no time for wonder or speculation. The fire was spreading, and soon the entire village would be consumed. She had to trust that whatever power slept within the egg would protect it better than any vault or strongbox ever could. "Catch!" she called, and hurled the egg up toward the window. Ragnhild's small hands reached out and caught it safely, pulling it into the darkness of the hall. As soon as the egg disappeared from view, Astrid felt a strange sense of loss, as if something important had just passed beyond her reach forever. But there was no time to dwell on such feelings. The battle still raged, and her people still needed her. She raced back toward the main conflict, where she found Eriksson and the surviving defenders pressed back almost to the doors of the great hall itself. Fewer than 20 warriors still stood, their shields battered and their weapons notched from constant use. The enemy pressed forward with renewed vigor, sensing that victory was finally within their grasp. "Where did you go?" Eriksson demanded as she took her place in the failing shield wall. Blood streamed from multiple wounds, but his grip on his sword remained steady. "Saving something precious," she replied, then raised her voice to address all the defenders. "Brothers, sisters, we have fought well this day, better than any skald's song could capture. But the time has come to choose. Do we die here like cornered beasts, or do we make such an end that our enemies will speak of it with respect around their fires for generations to come?" A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted warriors. They knew as well as she did that defeat was inevitable, but there was still honor to be won in the manner of their dying. "Then let us advance," Eriksson commanded. "Let them remember that the warriors of Ravenholm knew how to die." The final charge was brief but glorious. The defenders hurled themselves at their enemies with such ferocity that the attacking force actually gave ground for a few precious moments. Astrid found herself fighting beside warriors she had known since childhood, their shields overlapping as they carved a path through the enemy ranks. For an instant, she almost believed they might break through, might find some way to turn the tide of battle through sheer will and courage. But numbers told in the end, as they always did. One by one, the defenders fell. Bjorn the Stout died with enemy spears in his back, but his axe buried in a foeman's skull. Young Eric fought until his sword broke, then continued with the jagged remnant until a dozen wounds finally brought him low. Even grizzled old Thorvald, who claimed to have fought in more battles than he could count, finally met his match when 3 enemy warriors attacked him simultaneously. Astrid found herself standing back to back with Eriksson as the circle of enemies closed around them. Her shield was split down the middle, held together only by the iron rim, and her sword was slick with blood, both her own and that of her foes. Every breath brought sharp pain from what she suspected were broken ribs, and her vision kept blurring from the head wound she'd taken when an enemy axe had glanced off her helmet. "It has been an honor," Eriksson said quietly, his voice barely audible over the jeers and taunts of the surrounding warriors. "The honor was mine, my Jarl," she replied. "To serve beside you, to fight for our people, there could be no greater privilege." The enemy Jarls pushed through their warriors to confront the last defenders personally. Ragnar Bloodaxe was there, his famous weapon dripping red in the afternoon light. Beside him stood Ulf Ironwolf, a giant of a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his skill in battle. The third Jarl, Grim the Ravager, bore the scars of a dozen campaigns across his weathered face. "Yield!" Ragnar commanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute victory. "Yield, and you may yet live to see another sunset." Eriksson spat in the dirt at Ragnar's feet. "We are not thralls to beg for life," he declared. "We are free warriors of Ravenholm, and we choose death with honor over life with shame." Astrid nodded her agreement, raising her notched sword one final time. Around them, the flames continued to spread through the village, sending columns of smoke into the darkening sky. In the distance, she could hear the crash of burning timbers as buildings collapsed into glowing ruins. But as the enemy warriors prepared to close in for the kill, something extraordinary happened. From within the great hall came a sound unlike anything Astrid had ever heard. A musical note that seemed to resonate in her very bones, pure and clear and somehow filled with incredible power. The sound grew stronger, joined by harmonies that no human throat could produce, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with otherworldly music. The attacking warriors stopped their advance, looking around in confusion and growing fear. Even the veteran Jarls seemed uncertain, their weapons wavering as the strange music continued to build in power and complexity. Then the great hall's stone walls began to glow. It started as a faint luminescence, barely visible in the afternoon light, but quickly grew brighter. The glow spread from the walls to the ground beneath, creating patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the mysterious music. Everyone present, friend and foe alike, stared in amazement as the ancient building transformed before their eyes. "What sorcery is this?" demanded Ulf Ironwolf, but his voice carried more fear than anger. Astrid had no answer, but deep in her heart she suspected she knew the source of this miracle. The dragon egg, somehow, in ways she could not understand, it was responding to the fire and chaos around it. The old stories spoke of such things, of ancient powers that could be awakened in times of greatest need. The music reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very mountains, and then, with a sound like thunder, the great hall's roof exploded outward in a shower of burning timbers and golden sparks. From within rose something that had not been seen in the northern lands for 500 years. A phoenix, not the great dragon of legend, but something equally magnificent. A bird of living flame the size of a warhorse, its wings trailing fire as it rose into the darkening sky. Its cry was the music they had heard, a song of rebirth and renewal that spoke to something deep in every warrior's soul. The phoenix circled overhead once, twice, 3 times, and with each pass more light poured from its flaming form. Where the light touched the burning buildings, the flames changed from destructive orange to healing gold. Where it touched the wounded, their pain eased and their strength returned. And where it touched the dragon egg, still clutched in young Ragnhild's amazed hands, as she peered up through the ruined roof, something began to crack. Astrid watched in wonder as thin lines of brilliant light appeared on the egg's surface, spreading like a spider's web across the ancient scales. The cracks widened, and from within came a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, the first cry of a newly hatched dragon. The enemy warriors began to flee. These were brave men who would face death in battle without flinching, but this was beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to fight or comprehend. They ran for their ships, abandoning weapons and wounded comrades in their haste to escape whatever power had been awakened in this cursed place. Even the Jarls retreated, though they maintained better order than their panicked followers. Ragnar Bloodaxe paused at the edge of the village to shout back at the survivors, "This is not over. We will return with iron and fire." But his words carried little conviction. All present understood that something fundamental had changed, that the old balances of power had been shattered by forces beyond mortal ken. As the enemy longships disappeared into the gathering dusk, Astrid helped Eriksson to his feet, and together they approached the ruins of the great hall. The phoenix had vanished, leaving only the memory of its impossible beauty, but the effects of its presence remained. The wounds of the survivors were healing with unnatural speed, and strength flowed back into exhausted limbs. And from within the hall came the sound of children's laughter, mixed with the excited chirping of something very small and very much alive. The dragon egg had hatched. Dawn broke grey and cold over the ruins of Ravenholm, but for the first time in her adult life, Astrid Ironborn felt something she had nearly forgotten: hope. She stood among the charred remains of the village's central square, watching smoke rise from the smouldering buildings, yet her heart was lighter than it had been in years. Beside her, the newly hatched dragon perched on a broken wooden beam, no larger than a hawk, but already showing signs of the magnificent creature it would become. The little dragon, Ragnhild had named it Ember for the golden glow that seemed to emanate from its scales, chirped softly as it stretched wings still wet from the egg. Its eyes were ancient beyond its hours of life, holding depths of wisdom that made even grizzled warriors step back in respectful awe. "The phoenix was just the beginning," Eriksson said quietly, his weathered hand resting on his sword hilt, more from habit than any expectation of immediate danger. The surviving Jarl had aged a decade in the past day, the weight of leadership and loss etched deep in every line of his face. "I can feel it in my bones. Change is coming to all the northern lands." Astrid nodded, her gaze moving from the dragon to the handful of survivors who had emerged from the great hall. 23 souls remained from a village that had once housed over 200. Men, women and children, who now looked to her and Eriksson for guidance in this strange new world they found themselves inhabiting. "The old man speaks truly," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Ingvar the Wise, the village's eldest member and keeper of the ancient stories. At 80 winters, he moved slowly but with purpose. His roomy eyes, bright with knowledge gleaned from decades of listening to travelers' tales and studying the old runes. "I have seen the signs in dream and omen. The time of legends returns to our lands." The old skald approached the dragon carefully, extending one gnarled finger toward the creature. Ember studied him for a moment, then allowed the touch, its scales warming under Ingvar's gentle caress. The sight of the ancient man communing with the newly born dragon sent shivers through all who witnessed it. "In the old days," Ingvar continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence he used when reciting the great stories, "it was said that dragons would return when the world faced its darkest hour, when the bonds between clans shattered and brother raised sword against brother, when the old ways crumbled and new powers rose from the ashes of the past." Now young Ragnhild, still clutching the empty fragments of the dragon's egg, stepped forward. At 12 winters, she possessed the bold curiosity of youth, combined with a practical wisdom that reminded Astrid of herself at that age. "But what does it mean for us? The 3 clans will return with greater numbers. Word will spread of what happened here, and others will come seeking the dragon for themselves." Her words hung heavy in the morning air. Everyone present understood the truth of them. Ravenholm's brief moment of miracle would soon give way to the harsh realities of survival in a world where dragon lore meant power beyond imagining. Astrid looked around at the ruins of her home, calculating resources and possibilities with the tactical mind that had kept her alive through countless battles. The great hall still stood, its stone walls scorched but intact. Several of the storage buildings had survived the fire, meaning they had enough food and supplies to last through the coming winter. More importantly, the village's spring remained pure and flowing, providing the fresh water essential for any extended defense. "We cannot stay here," she announced, the decision crystallizing in her mind as she spoke. "Not as we are, not with so few to defend these walls, but neither can we simply flee and hope our enemies lose interest. The dragon changes everything. It makes us too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to leave in peace." Bjorn's youngest son, Harald, stepped forward. At 16, he was now the closest thing to a warrior the village possessed, aside from Astrid herself. The boy had fought bravely during the battle, standing in the shield wall until the very end. Now his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death too young. "Then what do you propose?" he asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We cannot fight, and we cannot flee. What options remain?" Before Astrid could answer, Ember raised its head and released a series of musical notes. Not quite a song, but clearly some form of communication. The sound was beautiful beyond description, like distant bells mixed with the whisper of wind through mountain peaks. As the dragon sang, its scales brightened, shifting from their usual golden hue to deep emerald green. Ingvar's eyes widened in recognition. "It speaks of allies," he translated, his voice filled with wonder. "Dragons can sense their own kind across vast distances. This little one tells us that others stir in distant lands. Ancient eggs, long thought dead, beginning to show signs of life. Mature dragons emerging from centuries of hidden slumber." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If dragons were awakening across the northern kingdoms, it meant the old power structures would crumble. Jarls who had ruled through strength of arms alone would find themselves facing forces beyond their comprehension. But it also meant that those wise enough to understand the changing times, brave enough to adapt, might find themselves rising to heights previously unimaginable. "There are ruins," Eriksson said slowly, his mind clearly working through possibilities. "Old fortifications in the mountains to the north, built in the days when dragons and men fought side by side against the ice giants. Most people believe them to be cursed, which is why they've remained untouched all these years." Astrid felt excitement building in her chest. She knew the place he meant, Dragonhold, a massive fortress carved directly into the living rock of the mountainside. Legend claimed it had been built by the dragon kings of old, rulers who had commanded both human armies and flights of the great worms. If even half the stories were true, it would be the perfect stronghold for their small band. "It's a 3-day march through difficult terrain," she mused, already beginning to plan the logistics of such a move. "But if we could establish ourselves there before our enemies realize what we're about." "The mountain passes are treacherous," Harold pointed out. "Even in good weather, it would be dangerous to attempt with children and elderly, and we have no way of knowing what we might find when we arrive, if the place even still exists." It was a valid concern, but Astrid found herself looking at Ember, who had resumed its musical communication. The dragon's meaning became clearer with each passing moment, not through words, but through images and emotions that seemed to flow directly into her mind. She saw vast stone halls lit by dragon fire, ancient forges capable of creating weapons and armor beyond anything possessed by mortal smiths, and most importantly, a great nest where eggs waited to hatch when the time was right. "The dragon knows the way," she said with growing certainty. "More than that, it knows what waits for us there. Dragonhold isn't empty. It's been waiting." Over the next few hours, the survivors of Ravenholm prepared for a journey unlike any their people had ever attempted. What few supplies they could carry were distributed among the group, with priority given to warm clothing and preserved food that would not spoil during the mountain crossing. Weapons were checked and sharpened, though everyone understood that if they encountered serious opposition on the trail, their small numbers would be quickly overwhelmed. Ember had grown noticeably larger during the morning, now roughly the size of a small cat rather than a hawk. Its intelligence was clearly developing at an extraordinary rate. It seemed to understand not just the general meaning of human speech, but the subtle emotional currents that ran beneath the words. When young Sigrid began to cry from fear and exhaustion, the dragon flew to her shoulder and sang softly until her tears stopped. When old Ingvar stumbled while gathering his possessions, Ember was there to guide him to a place where he could rest. "It's not just growing physically," Astrid observed to Eriksson as they watched the dragon interact with their people. "Its bond with us is deepening by the hour. I can feel its emotions, sometimes even catch glimpses of its thoughts." The Jarl nodded grimly. The old stories speak of such connections between dragons and their chosen companions. But they also warn of the price. Those who bond deeply with dragons often find their own humanity changing. Before she could ask what he meant, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horns echoing across the fjord. Everyone froze, weapons appearing in hands with practiced speed. But these were not the war horns of approaching enemies. The sound was different, more musical, almost celebratory. "Ships approaching from the west," Harold reported from his position atop the ruined watchtower. "But these aren't longships. They're merchant vessels, and they're flying peace banners." Astrid felt Ember's excitement spike, the dragon's emotional state affecting her own mood, despite her attempts to maintain professional detachment. Whatever was happening, the little creature clearly viewed it as positive news. The ships beached an hour later, disgorging a most unusual collection of passengers. There were traders from the southern kingdoms, their exotic clothes and strange accents marking them as foreigners to these northern lands. But mixed among them were figures Astrid recognized, northern clan members from settlements scattered across the region, all bearing expressions of wonder and barely contained excitement. Their leader was a woman of middle years, her silver-streaked hair braided with unusual beads that seemed to shift color in the sunlight. She approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, but her eyes held the same mixture of awe and uncertainty that had marked everyone's behavior since the Phoenix appeared. "I am Helga Stormcaller," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of a successful merchant who had negotiated in a dozen different kingdoms. "Word has spread faster than wildfire. The dragons have returned to the northern lands. We come seeking alliance with those who would stand at the center of the coming changes." Eriksson stepped forward to respond, but Ember suddenly took flight, circling overhead in tight spirals while releasing a complex series of musical calls. From one of the merchant ships came an answering cry, deeper, more mature, but unmistakably similar. A second dragon emerged from the vessel's hold, this one significantly larger than Ember and bearing scales of deep blue-black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The creature was clearly older, perhaps having hatched weeks or even months earlier, and it moved with the confident grace of a predator, secure in its power. "This is Shadowwing," Helga explained as the dragon settled on her shoulder with casual familiarity. "Found as an egg in the ruins of an ancient temple, hatched during the great storm that struck our settlement 2 months ago. Since then, similar discoveries have been reported from across the northern kingdoms, dragons returning to a world that had forgotten their existence." The two dragons flew to each other, engaging in what could only be described as conversation through their musical calls. Ember seemed almost vibrant with joy at finding another of its kind, while Shadowwing adopted a more protective, elder sibling attitude toward the smaller creature. "How many?" Astrid asked, hardly daring to hope. "Confirmed hatchings in 7 settlements," Helga replied. "Rumors of more, but also reports of conflicts as various jarls and kings try to claim the dragons for themselves. The old powers are fragmenting as word spreads. Some see opportunity, others see threat. War is coming on a scale our people have never known." As if to emphasize her words, another horn sounded from the east, this one definitely a war horn, deep and menacing. Everyone turned to see dust clouds on the horizon, marking the approach of a large force moving at speed. "Ragnar Bloodaxe," Eriksson said grimly. "He's returned sooner than expected, and he's brought reinforcements." Through the dust, Astrid could make out the glint of sunlight on steel and the colorful banners of at least 5 different clans. The defeated jarls had not wasted time nursing their wounds. They had used their tale of dragons and phoenix to rally a much larger alliance. "How long until they reach us?" Helga asked, her merchant's eye already calculating odds and options. "Less than 2 hours," Harold reported from his watchtower position. "And they're not alone. I count ships moving in from the south as well. We're about to be surrounded." The next hour passed in frantic preparation. Helga's people had brought weapons and supplies, but even combined with the survivors of Ravenholm, their numbers remained pitifully small compared to the approaching army. The ruins of the village offered little in the way of defensive positions, and retreat to the mountains would be impossible with enemies approaching from multiple directions. But as despair began to creep into even the strongest hearts, Ember and Shadowwing took to the air, their combined songs rising above the sounds of preparation and approaching battle. The music seemed to carry impossible distances, echoing off the mountain peaks and rolling across the water like thunder. From the north came an answering call, then another from the west, and a third from the high peaks themselves. Astrid felt her heart leap as she realized what was happening. The dragons were calling to each other across the vast distances, and their calls were being answered. "Look!" Ragnhild shouted, pointing toward the northern mountains. High above the peaks, dark shapes were moving against the grey sky, not just 1 or 2, but dozens, dragons of all sizes emerging from hidden lairs and forgotten nests drawn by the call of their newly hatched kin. Some were clearly ancient, their massive forms speaking of centuries of hidden existence, while others appeared young and eager, newly awakened to their heritage. The approaching enemy army had also seen the dragons, and their ordered advance was beginning to show signs of uncertainty. Facing human enemies, even outnumbered, required only courage and skill. But dragons belong to the realm of legend and nightmare, forces beyond normal human comprehension or resistance. As the dragons drew closer, Astrid could see that they were not all the same. Some bore the traditional reptilian form of the ancient stories, with great wings and serpentine necks. Others showed different lineages, some more bird-like, others with features that seemed almost feline. The diversity was staggering, suggesting that dragonkind had developed along many different paths during their long absence from the world. The largest of the approaching dragons, a massive creature with scales like burnished copper, landed near the ruins of the Great Hall with ground-shaking impact. Its eyes, each larger than a warrior's shield, surveyed the assembled humans with ancient intelligence. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of centuries. "Little ones," it rumbled, the words somehow clear despite the creature's inhuman throat structure. "Too long have we slept, while the world forgot the old bonds. But the time of awakening has come, and those who would stand with us shall know power beyond imagining." Astrid stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Great One, we are few and weak, surrounded by enemies who would use the young dragons for their own purposes. We seek only to protect those under our care and find a place where ancient bonds might be renewed." The great dragon considered her words, then turned its massive head toward Ember and Shadowwing. The young dragons flew to their elder, engaging in rapid musical conversation that seemed to convey complex information in moments rather than words. "You speak of Dragonhold," the copper dragon finally said. "The ancient fortress, where men and dragons once stood as equals. Yes, it still stands, and yes, it awaits those worthy to claim it. But the path is guarded by tests that will challenge more than just courage or strength." Before Astrid could ask what those tests might involve, the sound of approaching armies grew too loud to ignore. The enemy forces had overcome their initial fear and were advancing again, though with more caution than before. The sight of so many dragons had clearly shaken them, but the promise of claiming such power for themselves was driving them forward. "We will speak more of tests and ancient bonds," the copper dragon declared, its voice carrying easily over the din. "But first, let these fools learn why dragons were once feared above all other creatures." What followed was less a battle than a demonstration of overwhelming force. The dragons rose into the air like a living storm, their combined roars shaking the very mountains. Fire rained from the sky, not the destructive flames of war, but something more focused and purposeful. Weapons melted in warriors' hands, but the men themselves remained unharmed. Ships found their sails burning away, while their hulls remained intact, leaving crews stranded but alive. Within minutes, the great alliance that had come to claim dragons for themselves was fleeing in all directions, their warriors throwing down weapons and armor in their haste to escape. Some Jarls tried to maintain order, but the sight of creatures from legend and nightmare proved too much for even veteran warriors to endure. As the dust settled and silence returned to the ruins of Ravenholm, Astrid found herself standing in the center of what could only be described as a new world. Dragons perched on every available surface, their eyes bright with intelligence and purpose. Her own people moved among them with growing wonder, fear giving way to awe as they realized these creatures meant them no harm. "So," Helga said, her merchant's pragmatism reasserting itself despite the incredible circumstances. "It seems our journey to Dragonhold will be more interesting than anticipated." The copper dragon lowered its great head until it was level with Astrid's own. Up close, she could see the wisdom of ages in those ancient eyes, along with something else. Hope, perhaps, or anticipation of changes yet to come. "The tests I spoke of are not trials of combat or endurance," it explained. "They are tests of understanding, of the willingness to accept that the old ways are ending and new possibilities are beginning. Those who would claim Dragonhold must prove themselves worthy not just of dragon alliance, but of dragon transformation." "Transformation?" Astrid asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. The bonds between human and dragon run deeper than mere alliance, the great creature replied. In the ancient days, those who served as dragon companions found their own nature, evolving, enhanced strength and senses, extended lifespans, the ability to understand dragon speech, and in time to share in dragon flight. But such gifts come with the responsibility to guide both peoples through the changes ahead. Looking around at her companions, at young Ragnhild, whose eyes shone with fearless curiosity, at grizzled Eriksson, whose tactical mind was already working through the implications, at practical Helga, whose merchant's network could spread word of these changes across the known world, Astrid felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. The old world was ending, that much was clear. The age of simple clan warfare and petty kingdoms was giving way to something larger, more complex, more wondrous than anything their ancestors had imagined. Dragons had returned, and with them came possibilities that would reshape the northern lands beyond recognition. But first, they had to reach Dragonhold and prove themselves worthy of the legacy waiting there. As Ember settled on her shoulder, its warm scales pressed against her neck, Astrid felt the first stirrings of the bond that would change everything. The journey ahead would test them all in ways they could not yet imagine. But for the first time since the burning of Ravenholm, she was certain they would not face those tests alone. 3 months had passed since the Great Awakening at Ravenholm, and the world had indeed changed beyond recognition. From her position atop the highest tower of Dragonhold, Astrid looked out over the transformed landscape with eyes that saw far more than they once had. The dragon bond had indeed changed her, as the copper dragon, who she had learned was called Flameheart, had warned. Her vision was sharper, her reflexes faster, and her understanding of the complex relationships between the various dragon clans had deepened beyond anything she could have imagined in her previous life. Below, the ancient fortress bustled with activity as dragon riders from across the northern kingdoms arrived daily, seeking training and alliance. The great courtyard, once empty and overgrown, now hosted both human warriors learning to fight alongside their dragon partners and young dragons practicing the aerial maneuvers that would make them formidable in battle. Ember, now grown to the size of a small horse, perched beside her on the tower's edge. The dragon's intelligence had developed even faster than its body, and their bond had deepened to the point where Astrid sometimes found it difficult to tell where her thoughts ended and Ember's began. It was both exhilarating and occasionally unsettling, this merging of human and dragon consciousness. The southern kingdoms send emissaries, Ember observed, its mental voice carrying notes of amusement. They offer treaties and trade agreements, but their fear is plain to see. Astrid smiled at her partner's perception. The dragon was right. Word of the awakening had spread far beyond the northern lands, and the established powers of the south were struggling to understand how to respond to this new reality. Some offered friendship and alliance, others threatened war, but all were forced to acknowledge that the old balance of power had shifted permanently. "Fear is understandable," she replied, both aloud and through the mental link they shared. "Change is always frightening, especially change of this magnitude, but those who adapt will thrive, while those who cling to the old ways will find themselves left behind." From the great hall below came the sound of voices raised in discussion, the daily council meeting where representatives from various settlements and dragon clans worked together to establish the new order. It had not been easy combining human political structures with dragon hierarchies that operated on entirely different principles, but gradually they were building something unprecedented in recorded history. Helga Stormcaller had proven invaluable in this process, her merchant's understanding of complex negotiations helping to bridge the gap between radically different worldviews. Her bond with Shadowwing had evolved as well, the blue-black dragon serving as a sort of translator between the various dragon factions and their human allies. Young Ragnhild, now bearing the title of Dragon Keeper, had shown a remarkable aptitude for caring for newly hatched dragons and helping to establish the initial bonds with their human partners. At 15, she commanded respect from warriors twice her age, her intuitive understanding of dragon nature making her indispensable to the growing community. Even old Ingvar had found new purpose, his vast knowledge of ancient lore proving crucial as they worked to restore forgotten rituals and ceremonies that strengthened the human-dragon bond. The elderly Skald had taken to riding a gentle elderly dragon named Whisper Wind, the pair of them serving as living libraries of tradition and wisdom. But it was Jarl Eriksson's transformation that perhaps best exemplified how completely their world had changed. The grizzled leader had initially resisted the idea of bonding with a dragon, claiming he was too old and set in his ways. But when a magnificent silver dragon named Stormclaw had chosen him as a partner, the combination of human tactical brilliance and dragon power had proven devastatingly effective. Together, they now led the military aspects of their growing alliance, training the new generation of dragon riders who would defend their territories. A movement in the sky caught Astrid's attention, a formation of dragons approaching from the east, their synchronized flight patterns indicating trained riders. As they drew closer, she recognized the banner of the Easthold clan, one of the smaller settlements that had recently requested admission to their alliance. "More refugees?" Ember inquired, though the dragon's tone suggested it already knew the answer. "More allies," Astrid corrected gently. "Word continues to spread. Every settlement that successfully bonds with dragons finds itself targeted by those who fear the change. They come here seeking protection and training." It was true. The 3 months since the awakening had not been peaceful ones for most of the northern kingdoms. Traditional power structures were collapsing as Jarls found themselves unable to compete with dragon-bonded rivals. Some had chosen to adapt, seeking their own dragon partnerships and joining the growing alliance. Others had declared war on what they saw as an abomination of the natural order, launching increasingly desperate attacks on dragon-bonded settlements. The results of such attacks were predictable. Dragons were simply too powerful for traditional weapons and tactics to overcome. But Astrid had insisted that their response be measured, defeating armies without unnecessary slaughter, burning weapons while sparing the warriors who wielded them. It was a delicate balance between demonstrating their overwhelming superiority and maintaining some hope for eventual reconciliation. "The southern kingdoms will not remain observers much longer," Ember noted, sharing images through their bond of the massive armies reportedly gathering beyond the great mountains. "Their fear will drive them to action, regardless of the futility." Astrid nodded grimly. The reports from their far-ranging scouts were troubling. The southern rulers had apparently concluded that the dragon awakening represented an existential threat to their way of life, and they were preparing a massive military response. It would be a slaughter, but it would also force her people to make choices about how far they were willing to go to defend their new way of life. A young dragon rider approached, climbing the tower stairs with the easy confidence of someone who had already fully adapted to their transformed existence. It was Harold, now bearing the title of Wing Commander, his youthful features marked by the subtle changes that came with deep dragon bonding, eyes that held flecks of gold, reflexes enhanced beyond human norm, and an aura of quiet authority that commanded respect from both humans and dragons alike. "Astrid," he called as he reached the top of the tower, "the council has reached a decision about the southern threat. Eriksson requests your presence in the Great Hall." She nodded, giving Ember a gentle pat before making her way down the ancient stone steps. The fortress had been restored to functionality over the past months, but traces of its original grandeur were everywhere. Carved dragon motifs in the stonework, chambers clearly designed for creatures much larger than humans, and most impressively, the great rookery where dragon eggs were carefully tended by dedicated keepers. The Great Hall buzzed with activity as representatives from dozens of settlements debated strategy and policy. Maps covered the massive oak table that dominated the center of the room, marked with colored stones representing dragon-bonded communities, traditional settlements, and potential threats. The diversity of those present would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Grizzled jarls sitting beside teenage dragon riders, weathered merchants deep in conversation with ancient dragons whose voices resonated through the stone walls. "Ah, Astrid!" Ericsson called as she entered. "Perfect timing! We've just received word from our scouts in the south. The coalition armies have begun their march north, 3 kingdoms united, perhaps 50,000 warriors, all convinced they can somehow turn back the tide of change through force of arms. Flameheart, the great copper dragon, who had become the unofficial leader of their kind, lowered its massive head to address the assembly. The young ones wish to meet this threat head-on, to demonstrate our power so decisively that no future challenge will be contemplated. But wisdom suggests a more educational approach. "What do you propose?" asked Helga, shadowing perched behind her chair like a living shadow. The ancient dragon's eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement. "Let them come. Let them see what they face. But when they flee, and they will flee, we follow, not to destroy, but to demonstrate. Every settlement, every kingdom they retreat through will witness the futility of opposing the new order. Fear will accomplish what force alone cannot." Astrid considered the proposal carefully. It was elegant in its simplicity, but it also carried risks. "And if they don't flee, if their fear drives them to fight to the death, then we adapt," Ember replied through their shared bond, its mental voice carrying notes of steel beneath the musical tones. "We are not bound by the limitations of the old ways. We can be as merciful or as terrible as circumstances require." The debate continued for hours, touching on everything from tactical deployment to the long-term implications of their decisions for human-dragon relations. But as afternoon faded into evening, a consensus emerged. They would meet the southern threat, but not as conquerors. They would be teachers, demonstrating through overwhelming but controlled force that the age of traditional warfare was ending. As the council dispersed, Astrid found herself once again atop the tower, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Below, the fortress settled into its evening routine, dragons returning from patrol flights, riders tending to their partners' needs, and the soft glow of dragon fire lighting workshops where new weapons and equipment were being crafted using techniques that blended ancient knowledge with practical innovation. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Ember quietly. "The changes, the responsibility, the weight of shaping this new world." The dragon was silent for a long moment, its scales shifting through subtle color changes that reflected its emotional state. When it finally responded, the answer came not in words, but in shared images and feelings. The joy of flight, the deep satisfaction of perfect partnership, the excitement of discovering new possibilities every day. "Never," Ember finally said aloud, its voice carrying absolute certainty. The old world was ending anyway, consumed by its own conflicts and limitations. We have simply chosen to guide the birth of what comes next, rather than mourn what was lost. In the distance, the sound of dragon song echoed off the mountain peaks, a complex harmony created by dozens of voices, each adding its own melody to the greater composition. It was beautiful beyond description, but more than that, it was a symbol of unity that transcended the old boundaries between species, clans, and kingdoms. The world was changing, and there would be challenges ahead that none of them could yet imagine. The southern armies were only the beginning. Eventually, they would need to establish relationships with distant lands across the great oceans, navigate the complex politics of a world where dragons were once again players on the grand stage, and somehow build institutions that could survive the inevitable conflicts between human ambition and dragon wisdom. But as Astrid sat in comfortable silence with her partner, watching the stars wheel overhead while the ancient fortress hummed with purposeful activity below, she felt something she had never experienced before: complete confidence in the future. They had already survived the impossible, transformed the unthinkable into reality, and forged bonds that would endure long after all present had passed into legend. The age of dragons had returned, and with it came possibilities as limitless as the sky itself. The phoenix had risen from the ashes of the old world, and its children would inherit wonders beyond imagining.